Ukraine steals Russia's secret Kinzhal and a MiG-31 college, and with minutes, the sky turns against its original owner.
At 6:14 a.m., a MiG-31 Foxhound sits on a rough strip in southern Ukraine with its canopy shut and its engines screaming, while the far end of the runway collapses into flame as Russian Iskander missiles hammer the concrete in staggered impacts that walk closer with each second. Captain Alexei Volkov has no room to taxi, no time to shut down, and no safe direction to run, because the jet under him is not just an aircraft anymore. It is a nuclear-capable delivery platform carrying a Ku-47 M2 Kinzhal hypersonic missile. And every sensor in the region is hunting it like a beacon that refuses to dim. The problem is that surviving the ground strike is only the first gate, not the last one, because the moment he lifts off, he will be inside the engagement envelope of an S-400 Triumph battery that already has a track on his departure corridor. If he stays, the runway becomes a furnace, and the jet becomes scrap. If he climbs, the radar lock becomes a countdown with no mercy. And a 48 N6 interceptor can be airborne and accelerating to Mach-class speeds before he finishes retracting his landing gear. This is the kind of choice that turns pilots into statistics, unless the pilot is willing to do something that sounds like madness, even in a war room. To understand why a Russian captain is gambling his life on Ukrainian soil, the clock has to rewind 4 hours to the Black Sea, where the same MiG-31 was cruising at 40,000 feet on a routine patrol line that looked boring on purpose. The Foxhound is often called a fighter, but the way it is described in this scenario makes it closer to a pair of enormous engines with a cockpit attached, built to climb, point its nose straight, and go very fast. On a clean day, it can push toward nearly 1,900 miles per hour, but today it is dragging a 4.3-ton missile under its belly, and the drag changes everything. With that Kinzhal mounted underneath, the jet becomes heavy, stubborn, and thirsty, like a sprinter forced to carry a grand piano while trying to keep up with a pack of racers who are unburdened. The aerodynamic penalty is constant, and the fuel burn is the kind that makes planners stare at maps like they are negotiating with physics. Volkov knows this better than anyone because he can feel it in the controls, in the sluggish response, and in the way the aircraft resists every small correction. But he also knows something else, something the Russian controllers watching their screens do not know yet. The weight under him is not just a weapon, it is leverage. Months earlier, this mission began as encrypted conversations with Ukraine's military intelligence, the kind that never appear in official briefings until long after the people involved have disappeared into new identities. Volkov had been flying patrols as part of a system he no longer believed in, and the scenario frames his decision as a trade between a dictator's reward and a clear conscience. The deal was simple in concept and brutal in execution. Bring the aircraft, bring the missile, and cross a line that cannot be uncrossed. In exchange, Ukraine would build a trap corridor through surveillance, deception, and timing, because a lone jet cannot outrun a nation once the alarms begin. The moment the plan becomes action, it happens without radio chatter or hesitation, because any hesitation would be read as weakness by the same air defense network he is trying to evade. Volkov slams the stick forward, and the Foxhound pitches over into a steep dive, trading altitude for speed as the sea rushes up to meet him. Instead of turning back to base, he drives straight toward Ukraine. And the change is so abrupt that the air defense picture in Crimea lights up like a warning panel. For a brief instant, the Russian controllers wonder if it is a malfunction or a medical emergency, because pilots do not usually do this on purpose. Then he levels out at roughly 50 feet above the water, turns off his transponder, and forces the situation to reveal its true nature. At that altitude, the curvature of the Earth becomes cover, and ground-based radar lines lose clean sight of him. But the margin for error shrinks to nothing. Fly higher and he is visible. Fly lower and a wave can end the story in one violent roll. Salt spray is so close it feels like it is trying to sandblast the canopy, and the jet's stability becomes a constant negotiation between speed, lift, and the drag of the missile acting like a giant air brake. He is betting that the radar shadow will hold long enough to reach the next layer of the trap. Russia does not treat it as a misunderstanding for long, because the object moving south is not a normal aircraft. It is a strategic system, and the scenario makes clear that the Kremlin realizes its invincible nuclear delivery asset is being stolen. 4 Su-35 flanker fighters scramble from Crimea, and that changes the geometry instantly, because the Su-35 is described as a modern, super-maneuverable dogfighter operating clean, light, and fast. Unlike the Foxhound dragging its belly weight, these jets can accelerate hard without paying the same penalty, and they carry R-77 radar-guided missiles with the reach to strike from far outside visual range. Volkov cannot win a straight race, and he cannot outturn a missile shot if he tries to fight like a conventional fighter pilot. So the script leans into physics as his only weapon. He stays glued to the sea, using surface clutter and Earth curvature to degrade the Russian targeting picture, and he forces the Su-35s to solve a harder problem than they expected. Their radars sweep the ocean surface, looking for a reflection that keeps disappearing into the noise, and the gap closes anyway, because clean jets closing on a dragged aircraft is not a debate. Inside the cockpit, the strain shows up as vibration, heat, and the awareness that his fuel is draining faster than the math wants to admit. The first unmistakable warning arrives as the radar warning receiver screams, and the tone signals an N035 class lock, meaning the lead Su-35 has finally pinned him. There is no negotiation, no demand to return, and no request for surrender, just a launch as 2 R-77 missiles fall away and ignite, switching into the kind of active homing hunt that does not care about bravery. Volkov has seconds, and with a 4.3-ton missile hanging under him, he cannot dance. So he chooses a move that is almost suicidal at wave-top height. He chops the throttle, deploys air brakes, and decelerates violently to confuse the Doppler solution. For a heartbeat, the missile's tracking logic loses the clean closure picture it expects, and his radar return blends with the waves below, just long enough for the shots to streak past and detonate in the water ahead. It is a narrow escape that creates an even worse position, because now he is slower, still low, and the remaining Su-35s are closing with anger instead of procedure. The near miss tells them he is deliberate and capable, not panicked, and that makes them dangerous in a different way. As they spread to box him in and push toward gun range, Volkov is running out of airspace, out of fuel margin, and out of time to reach the hidden hand Ukraine promised would appear. The turning point arrives when the MiG-31 reveals that it is not defenseless cargo, but a platform with teeth, because under its wings it still carries R-37M long-range missiles, designed for killing bombers at distances that feel unfair. These missiles are heavy and not elegant, but their warheads are enormous, and their purpose is simple. Volkov overrides low-altitude launch safeties that exist to protect pilots from themselves, because safety is no longer part of the equation. He pulls the nose up just long enough to be seen, deliberately exposing himself to enemy radar as bait, knowing that aggression is predictable when pride is involved. The lead Su-35 takes the invitation exactly as expected, diving in for what looks like a guaranteed kill against a slow, burdened interceptor. Volkov fires one R-37M head-on, and the missile leaves the rail like a thrown telephone pole, accelerating with purpose rather than grace. It does not need a direct hit, because its 132-pound warhead is designed to shred large aircraft. When it detonates roughly 98 feet in front of the Su-35, the result is instantaneous disintegration as shrapnel and overpressure tear through the airframe, sending the wreckage tumbling into the Black Sea below. The victory is real but fleeting, because the explosion is also a beacon that hands the remaining 3 Su-35s his exact location. Their response is not cautious, it is personal. They spread wide, abandon long-range shots, and push throttles to close within visual range, intending to finish the job with cannons rather than missiles. From their perspective, the Foxhound is a wounded animal, dragging dead weight, and the border is still minutes away. Inside the cockpit, Engine temperatures climb toward red lines, sweat blurs vision, and the vibration never stops. Because pushing the MiG this hard with that payload is like forcing metal to argue with itself. 2 minutes of survival is all the missile kill buys him, and 2 minutes is not enough to cross into safety. The Su-35s begin herding him away from the Ukrainian coast, forcing angles that favor their agility and denying him the straight-line escape he needs. They are not rushing anymore, they are controlling. The 30mm cannons under their noses are designed for exactly this kind of finish, and they are waiting for the cleanest shot. The scenario emphasizes that at this stage, skill alone is not enough. Volkov needs an external disruption that changes the entire picture, not just his own flight path. That disruption appears the moment he crosses an invisible boundary in the sky, because Ukrainian planning has been waiting for this geometry. Without warning, the radar scopes inside the Russian fighters flood eye with contacts, transforming a single target into what looks like an entire squadron materializing out of nowhere. Confusion ripples through their formations as pilots call out multiple returns that do not behave like real aircraft, but are impossible to filter cleanly. This is the deployment of 12 modified AQ-400 Scythe drones, each carrying a Lundberg lens that amplifies radar reflection until a cheap airframe looks like a 20-ton fighter on scope. Mixed into this cloud of false targets are electronic warfare pods, blasting noise across the X-band frequencies the Russian radars depend on, saturating tracking computers that are designed for precision, not chaos. The effect is deliberate overload rather than brute force jamming, and it works because it forces the Su-35s to solve too many problems at once. Locks break, reacquire, and break again, and targeting solutions never stabilize long enough to fire with confidence. To the Russian pilots, the sky has turned into a hall of mirrors where every contact could be real or could be a ghost. Volkov uses the confusion exactly as intended, pushing his throttles past limits that maintenance manuals exist to prevent, because manuals assume you plan to land the aircraft intact. He dives directly into the heart of the drone swarm, merging his signature with theirs so completely that on radar, he becomes just another identical return. A panicked Russian pilot fires his last pair of R-77 missiles at what looks like a heavy fighter, closing head-on, only to destroy a cheap drone built from plywood and foam. $1 million weapons vanish into explosions that achieve nothing, and that waste creates the opening Ukraine calculator. With the Su-35s busy chasing ghosts, the Foxhound slips through and drops its landing gear as a hidden forward operating base in southern Ukraine appears ahead. The runway is short, uneven, and never designed for an interceptor this heavy, especially one still carrying a hypersonic missile. The landing is hard and violent. Tires scream, smoke pours from overheated brakes, and the drag chute snaps open as the jet chews through concrete with meters to spare. When the aircraft finally stops, the silence is disorienting, because after hours of sustained stress, the absence of motion feels unreal. The relief lasts less than half a minute before sirens begin to wail across the airfield and a Ukrainian ground crew chief runs toward the jet, not with congratulations but with urgency. Engines stay running, because shutting down would cost time they do not have. A Russian reconnaissance satellite has already passed overhead, and the landing was visible from space. 200 miles away, an Iskander missile battery has received fresh coordinates and authenticated launch orders. The missiles are airborne before anyone on the ground finishes saying the words time to impact, which is 7 minutes. 7 minutes is barely enough to think, let alone refuel a MiG-31. But the Ukrainian crew swarms the aircraft anyway, performing a hot pit refuel that turns the tarmac into a potential inferno. Fuel hoses connect while engines spin and burn hot, and every spark becomes a threat that nobody has time to fear. In the middle of this controlled chaos, a young officer in a mismatched uniform sprints toward the cockpit carrying a ruggedized laptop, like it is the only thing that matters. This is Lieutenant Dmitro, 24 years old, a specialist whose battlefield is code rather than altitude. He does not waste words explaining rank or protocol. He tells Volkov that the Kinzhal is geofenced, locked by Russian software to prevent firing into Russian territory, and that if it is triggered without authorization, it will brick itself and become a 4.3-ton dead weight. The missile, as delivered, is obedient even in betrayal. Dmytro climbs into the rear seat and connects directly to the MiG's mission computer, bypassing anything that resembles a clean procedure, because the solution is not elegance, but deception. Instead of writing new code, which would take time they do not have, he inserts a pre-programmed hardware override chip supplied through Western intelligence channels. The chip carries a spoofing algorithm that lies convincingly to the missile's guidance brain, telling it that its target is a harmless practice range in the Pacific Ocean. While the missile believes this fiction, its inertial coordinates are quietly rewritten to point back toward the Russian radar that will soon try to kill them. The deception does not break the rules of the system. It obeys them in a way the designers never intended. As Dmytro races against the clock, the first Iskander impacts at the far end of the runway, sending a shockwave across the field that rattles teeth and shreds concrete. Another impact follows closer, and the explosions begin to march toward the aircraft. Fuel hoses are ripped free by hand as Volkov slams the canopy shut and pushes throttles to full military power. The MiG lurches forward, heavy with fuel and still carrying the missile, as the runway behind them disappears into fire and debris. The takeoff becomes a race against explosions that are literally chasing the jet down the concrete. The nose lifts just as the section of runway they occupied a second earlier disintegrates, and the Foxhound claws into the air under full afterburner, blue fire erupting from its tailpipes. They are airborne, but the danger only shifts shape, because the moment they climb, the Russian S-400 Triumph battery across the border locks on. Its Big Bird radar paints them cleanly, and a 48 N6 interceptor erupts from its canister, accelerating to Mach-class speeds as it hunts from behind. Inside the cockpit, Dmytro calls out the radar type and bearing, and Volkov understands that outrunning this missile is not an option. Volkov reacts by pulling the MiG-31 into a steep climb, trading speed for altitude, because altitude is the only currency that can buy him a launch window. The interceptor missile behind them is optimized for targets that run, not for targets that suddenly climb like an elevator. As the Foxhound roars upward, its belly is fully exposed to the enemy radar, but exposure is no longer the threat it was seconds ago. This climb is not an escape. It is preparation, and the aircraft strains under forces it was designed to endure only in short bursts. Inside the cockpit, warning tones overlap as airspeed bleeds off and engine temperatures flirt with limits that engineers assume pilots will respect. Volkov ignores them because the alternative is simpler and worse. He flips the master arm switch, and the aircraft responds with a physical shudder as 4.3 tons of missile detach from its belly. The Kinzhal's solid rocket motor ignites in a flash that briefly outshines the jet itself, and the hypersonic weapon arcs upward before curving back toward the border it was never supposed to face. Two missiles are now racing on intersecting paths, each trying to decide who lives next. The S-400 interceptor continues closing from behind, its guidance fed by the Big Bird radar that has tracked hundreds of targets without mercy. Dmytro watches numbers scroll across his screen, confirming that the spoofing algorithm is holding and that the Kinzhal believes it is executing a routine test profile. In reality, its inertial navigation is locked on a radar vehicle that is still transmitting confidently, unaware that its own emissions have just signed its death warrant. The sky over the border becomes a corridor of pure velocity. The interceptor missile is fast, but the Kinzhal is faster, screaming down from the stratosphere at speeds measured in thousands of miles per hour. Russian radar operators have no meaningful warning window because hypersonic timelines collapse decision cycles into moments that feel like glitches rather than events. The Kinzhal slams directly into the Big Bird radar vehicle, and the impact vaporizes it so completely that the command post disappears in the same instant. The shockwave flattens equipment, vehicles, and any illusion of control that existed seconds earlier. With the radar gone, The interceptor missile chasing Volkov loses its guidance input and goes blind, veering off into empty sky before detonating harmlessly far away. In the cockpit, the radar warning receiver falls silent, and the absence of noise is confirmation enough. The engagement is over, not because the MiG outran its hunter, but because the Archer was removed from the equation entirely. The cost to Russia is immediate and measurable. One Su-35 fighter lies at the bottom of the Black Sea. One hypersonic missile designed to intimidate rivals has been turned back on its own defenses. 400 battery, valued at roughly $500 million, is reduced to wreckage in a matter of seconds. On the Ukrainian side, the gains extend beyond survival. A MiG-31 Foxhound, intact and flyable, now sits in friendly hands, along with the technical knowledge embedded in its systems, procedures, and maintenance realities. The aircraft is no longer a symbol on a poster or a threat in a briefing. It is a machine that can be studied, understood, and neutralized in future planning. The intelligence value alone reshapes how planners think about interception, hypersonic delivery, and the limits of deterrence built on secrecy. Volkov's defection is framed not as a spontaneous act, but as the endpoint of months of quiet preparation, and the narrative emphasizes that no amount of technology can fully compensate for a human decision made under pressure. Electronic warfare, drones, spoofing chips, and hypersonic physics all mattered, but none of them would have activated without a pilot willing to cross a line that cannot be erased. In that sense, the operation becomes less about a single escape and more about the vulnerability of systems that assume loyalty as a constant. The scenario also underlines how modern air combat has shifted away from simple contests of speed or maneuverability into layered struggles involving sensors, software, and deception. Radar range means nothing if the picture is flooded with ghosts. Missile speed means nothing if the guidance chain can be severed. Even satellites, watching patiently from orbit, only compress timelines rather than guaranteeing outcomes. Each layer adds power, but each layer also adds a new surface for exploitation by an adversary willing to think asymmetrically. For Russian planners, the aftermath is not just a tally of losses, but a crisis of trust. Units operating Kinzhal systems are reportedly pulled back and rechecked, not because the missile failed, but because someone used it differently than intended. Commanders are forced to consider whether other digital leashes exist, and whether those leashes can be cut just as quietly. The fear is not that technology is weak, but that it depends too much on assumptions about who is holding the controls. For Ukraine, the operation becomes a case study in how limited resources can be amplified through timing, preparation, and an understanding of enemy doctrine. 12 inexpensive drones equipped with reflectors and noise were enough to neutralize elite fighters long enough for one jet to pass. A single hardware chip and a prepared algorithm were enough to turn a strategic weapon into a liability. The narrative consistently frames these choices as deliberate rather than lucky, emphasizing planning over improvisation. The human element remains central all the way through. Dmytro's role as a young specialist highlights how modern warfare increasingly relies on people who may never fire a weapon, but whose decisions carry strategic weight. His intervention lasts minutes, but those minutes decide whether the missile is dead weight or decisive leverage. The story avoids romanticizing chaos, instead showing competence under pressure as the true differentiator when seconds matter. As the MiG-31 disappears deeper into Ukrainian airspace, the immediate danger fades, but the implications do not. Air defense networks on both sides will be studied, modified, and hardened. Software assumptions will be questioned. Training scenarios will change. The event does not end a war, but it alters how both sides think about the relationship between technology and loyalty, and about how asymmetric thinking can puncture even the most confident claims of invulnerability. In the end, the scenario closes on a simple but uncomfortable conclusion. Advanced systems can dominate a battlefield, but they cannot decide why a person climbs into a cockpit in the first place. When that reason changes, the most sophisticated weapons in the world can be turned, delayed, confused, or destroyed by choices made far below the level of grand strategy. The MiG-31 survives not because it is the fastest aircraft in the sky, but because someone chose conscience over orders, and others built a plan to make that choice count. There's a moment in every air war when a plan stops being a plan and becomes a physics problem. And this one begins at 2:47 p.m. local time as a Ukrainian MiG-29 sits 90 seconds into Russian airspace with 2 French-designed AASM bombs slung under its wings and one job on the pilot's mind: reach a border guard post that Moscow treated like a safe, unbreakable valve in a supply route feeding Russian positions in Ukraine, hit it once and vanish back west before the sky can decide he no longer belongs in it. The aircraft is not cruising high like a parade flyover, it is skimming at treetop level where the horizon hides you from radars that cannot bend around terrain, and nothing about the cockpit feels modern or forgiving. The GPS is jammed, the fuel gauge is falling toward empty, and the pilot is navigating with a paper map taped to his knee because electronic confidence is a luxury that disappears first in contested airspace. And because this mission gives him exactly one clean attempt before fuel math turns bravery into a glide. Even the route is built like a thief's blueprint, not a warrior's charge, with the MiG using forests and valleys as cover while the pilot measures distance by landmarks instead of glowing waypoints, knowing that every extra second spent searching for the target is a second spent inside a net of sensors and launchers that do not need to see him long to kill him, and he is counting that truth in minutes because his reserve on paper was never generous. 6 seconds is sometimes the difference between a report and a funeral, and 6 seconds is how long a Russian podlet, Hay-1 radar near Klamovo, will later hold a real lock on the intruder before the contact slips behind a hill again. But none of that matters yet, because the first crisis arrives without malice, without strategy, and without warning. As the pilot watches a dark shape flash across the canopy at low altitude, and realizes the mission has just been challenged by a bird. At a closure rate of 180 kilometers per hour, a crow impacts the left engine intake, and the event is over before human thought can catch up, because the compressor blades inside that turbine are spinning at roughly 13,000 revolutions per minute, and they do not tolerate foreign objects, so the strike becomes a shredding, the shredding becomes a stall, and the stall becomes the sound pilots fear it most, a grinding shriek that means thrust has turned into drag. The MiG lurches left and begins to sink toward the forest below, and the pilot's hands move faster than emotion. Right rudder to fight asymmetric thrust, left hand pulling back to arrest the descent, right hand stabbing at the restart switch as the aircraft drops from around 200 meters to 180, then 160, with trees flashing by close enough that the cockpit feels like it has entered the world it was supposed to fly above, not through. A restart sequence takes time that low altitude does not offer, and the pilot is counting seconds against impact, while his oxygen and adrenaline make the cockpit feel smaller. And this is the cruel timing of war. The mistake happens at the exact moment the enemy's radar operator is already halfway convinced the intermittent return is nothing more than birds or terrain clutter, with small contacts appearing over ridgelines and vanishing into valleys like a sensor's bad dream. The podlet K1's operator reaches for his radio, then hesitates, because reporting a ghost means paperwork and embarrassment. And for a few human heartbeats, that hesitation becomes the mission's first real shield. The lock lasts 6 seconds. 2 more seconds would have produced a firing control solution, and instead of escalating, the operator chooses coffee, leaving a data point in a log that will not feel important until the aftermath is already burning. The MiG's left engine coughs back to life, around 140 meters, turbines sinking as thrust returns. But the recovery is not a reset, it is a compromise. because the engine is now running rough with compressor efficiency badly degraded, and the pilot knows what that means in the language that matters. Fuel consumption rises while options shrink, and a reserve that once looked like 12 minutes now reads like 3. Then the landscape adds another trap. Power lines that do not exist on the tactical map, appearing in the windscreen like a suspended wall about 60 meters above the valley floor, and at roughly 650 kilometers per hour. He has only a couple of seconds to react, pulling into a brutal climb that slams him with about 5G as the jet clears the top wires by less than 10 meters, and the electromagnetic field makes instruments flicker like frightened animals. Behind him, the radar operator is already walking away, and a replacement is staring at a strange return from minutes ago, wondering if it matters. While ahead, the pilot's hands are shaking from the near miss and from the knowledge that his margin is gone, and yet the route still demands discipline. Because the only way this works is if the paper map's promise is true, and the next landmark appears exactly when it should. It does. A distinctive bend in the Desna River that marks a navigation checkpoint about 10 kilometers from the release point. And the sight is not comforting so much as finalizing, because with one engine damaged and fuel set for a single attempt, the pilot is now preparing for what strategists call a suicide profile, a vertical climb through hostile airspace that will trade stealth for geometry, forcing the bombs to fly their best path while the jet becomes visible to everything. At 1441, the MiG reaches the initial point for the attack run, about 50 kilometers from the target, and still low enough to stay below the radar horizon. And for a brief stretch, the aircraft is a rumor rather than a track. But the pilot knows that in less than a minute, his plan will deliberately shatter that invisibility, because the only way to give the weapons their intended energy and angles is to climb like a flare into a sky packed with teeth. He pushes the throttles forward and hauls back on the stick, and the G-forces arrive instantly, crushing him into the seat as his suit inflates to keep blood from draining away. And yet it is still not enough, because at roughly 3,000 meters, his vision starts graying at the edges. At 5,000 meters, it narrows into a tunnel, and near 6,500 meters, consciousness becomes optional while muscle memory keeps the jet climbing. The MiG's nose is nearly vertical now, both engines screaming at maximum thrust, the damaged left engine vibrating like it wants to tear itself apart. And the cockpit's warning receiver begins filling with threats as air defenses across a wide radius suddenly have something to see, and the pilot cannot reduce power because altitude is the last currency he can spend to buy a release window, even as the next failure is waiting in the place nobody wants it. The weapons interface. The French AASM bombs are connected to a Soviet-era aircraft through a jury-rigged solution Ukrainian technicians built in a warehouse, and it worked perfectly on the ground. But under high G and thin air, a voltage regulator fails. The weapons panel floods with connection errors, and the bombs do not know they are supposed to release on time, forcing the pilot to keep climbing with one hand, while the other begins a frantic sequence of switches and overrides that has to work before someone else acts first. The emergency checklist is not a calm thing at 6G, and the pilot's oxygen-starved brain is juggling tasks that do not wait politely. Left hand holding the climb, right hand flipping through armament switches, cycling the master arm, switching to backup power, forcing a manual override that bypasses the digital interface entirely. Because if the bombs do not come off the pylons, there will be no second attempt and no gentle abort. Only a heavy jet carrying dead weight into a sky that is waking up angry. At the same moment, the weapons refuse to listen. A Russian Su-35 far beyond the horizon finishes connecting dots that were never meant to line up so neatly because the MiG's sudden vertical climb has announced itself to every radar operator within roughly 200 kilometers. And the Russian pilot does not hesitate, locking the climbing target and releasing an R-37M hypersonic missile from about 72 kilometers away, a weapon that turns distance into a brief inconvenience rather than safety. The MiG's radar warning receiver screams missile launch with a bearing and a closure rate that leaves no room for optimism, Because at Mach 6, the R-37M will cross the gap in roughly 36 seconds, and the Ukrainian pilot knows he cannot evade yet. Not while the bombs are still attached, not while altitude is the only reason this attack might still work, so he keeps the jet steady and fights the cockpit instead of the missile. Manual release switches sit where designers expected them to be used rarely, if ever, individual pickle buttons for each pylon that bypass the failed interface. And at around 8,000 meters, the pilot reaches the release point and smashes the first button, expecting an immediate drop, and instead getting nothing, holding it down through a 1-second count that stretches into panic before the bomb finally falls free and its rocket motor ignites after a heart-stopping delay. The second bomb releases faster as the manual system wakes up, and both AASM weapons pitch upward as their motors drive them higher still, climbing toward an apex, while the MiG finally sheds the last reason to stay predictable, rolling inverted and pulling into a violent split S that trades altitude for speed and reverses direction in a maneuver that exists to break solutions and steal seconds from guidance computers that assume aircraft behave politely. 9G crush. The pilot as the world goes black for a couple of seconds, and when vision returns, he is diving through about 4,000 meters with the missile still tracking. Because hypersonic weapons do not give up easily, and the jet's defenses are not having a good day either. At roughly 10 kilometers and closing, the missile is close enough that survival options collapse into geometry, and the pilot executes the last card in the deck, a notch maneuver that turns the aircraft perpendicular to the missile's path and drives relative motion towards zero, presenting the seeker with something that looks stationary against ground clutter. And for a brief instant, the guidance logic does exactly what it was designed to do and breaks lock. The R-37M flashes past about 100 meters behind the MiG, its proximity fuse failing to trigger as fragments from its self-destruct pepper the fighter's tail and punch small holes in the rudder. Damage the pilot does not even register because the only thought left is altitude, dirt, and survival, diving back toward the weeds where radars lose patience and missiles lose interest. While the jet fights for its life, the two French bombs are climbing into a quieter problem set, reaching an apex around 8,500 meters before beginning a 4-minute fall toward the border guard post at Bela Berioska, flying through empty sky on guidance modes that are already degrading because one rocket motor begins sputtering after ingesting contaminated fuel, water vapor that froze at altitude and then turned to steam in the combustion chamber. Inside the bomb, a processor no larger than a wallet runs numbers without emotion, calculating that current thrust shortfall means an impact roughly 2 kilometers short if nothing else intervenes. Because near Bryansk, a Kursuka 4 electronic warfare vehicle powers up and floods GPS frequencies with precisely tuned noise that instantly erases signals coming from satellites tens of thousands of kilometers away. Both bombs lose satellite navigation at the same time and drop onto inertial systems alone, mechanical gyroscopes spinning in darkness and accumulating error with every passing second, meters stacking quietly until by the time they near the target, they should be hundreds of meters off, which for most weapons would mean failure. Except these bombs were designed with redundancy born from experience. They switch seamlessly to backup logic, inertial navigation for rough guidance, and infrared seekers for the terminal phase. But timing is cruel again. And when the second bomb's infrared sensor activates around 3,000 meters, it locks onto a heat source registering thousands of degrees Kelvin, immediately rejecting it as impossible and breaking lock into a white glare that blinds it for precious seconds. For roughly 15 seconds, that bomb flies blind, covering kilometers with no terminal correction while its processor cycles through filtering algorithms and contrast enhancement routines that were never tested against a sun positioned exactly where a target should be. While the first bomb meets a different enemy at 5,000 meters, where the edge of the jet stream catches its fins and yaws the weapon violently off course. The Russian air defenses finally notice something falling east, And at Clovo, an S-400 battery detects two small radar contacts with a cross-section too small for aircraft and too fast for helicopters. But standing orders remove doubt, and two 48N6 missiles launch anyway in a gesture of doctrine rather than physics, because ballistic freefall does not offer the predictable path those interceptors need. The missiles race upward and pass harmlessly through empty sky as their computers fail to calculate a solution, leaving the bombs to continue downward toward a compound protected by a Panzer S-1 system that has never trained for weapons arriving nearly straight down. The Panzer S-1 guarding the border post finally locks the falling objects at a range that feels absurd to its operator because the radar picture shows targets arriving at an angle close to vertical, about 87 degrees, descending faster than any cruise missile profile he trained against. And the system's computer responds with an answer that makes no tactical sense. Target outside engagement zone. At roughly 900 meters altitude, the operator fires anyway, launching a short salvo of 57 E-6 missiles that leap from their rails and accelerate toward Mach 3. Exactly 1.5 seconds after launch, the missiles arm and self-destruct almost immediately, their fragments falling harmlessly across the compound like steel rain, while the operator transitions to guns, swinging the twin 2A38 M30mm cannons upward and unleashing thousands of tungsten-cored rounds in a roaring cone of fire that stops just short of the required elevation. While the first bomb seeker struggles to hold lock through damaged gyroscopes and offset error, making last-second corrections as exhaust plumes from parked vehicles bloom into clear infrared targets. At 14:51, the first AASM impacts, a 340-kilogram mass punching through the roof of the border post building at over 300 meters per second. And the kinetic energy alone collapses internal structures before the shaped charge detonates, sending a jet of superheated copper sideways through load-bearing walls and turning a vertical strike into a catastrophic lateral failure. Instead of collapsing neatly downward, the building topples like a felled tree, its north side giving way as walls shear and roofs fold. And the effect is worse than a centered hit. The impact ruptures fuel tanks on 3 BTR-82A vehicles simultaneously, and instead of an immediate explosion, the diesel fuel aerosolizes, mixing with air in a nearly perfect ratio that waits for ignition, which arrives instantly from the shaped charge, creating a fuel-air explosion that reaches roughly 4,000 degrees Celsius for just over 1 second. Vehicles do not burn so much as dissolve, metal softening and collapsing as the blast consumes oxygen and leaves behind warped frames and scorched earth. And within moments, the compound is engulfed in secondary fires that defeat any remaining defensive posture, while the last fragments of failed interceptors clatter uselessly onto concrete already splitting from heat. Above it all, the MiG-29 is already gone, diving west on one damaged engine with fuel gauges hovering near empty and the pilot only half aware of the world beyond keeping the jet upright, his body still recovering from sustained G-forces and his mind running through a quiet inventory of what still works and what does not. As the fighter crosses back into Ukrainian airspace, radars lose interest and missiles lose angles, and the sky that felt crowded minutes earlier opens into something like silence, broken only by the vibration of a wounded engine that somehow keeps turning, carrying its pilot away from a mission that was never supposed to be clean. Behind him, smoke rises from Bela Berioska in thick columns visible for kilometers, marking a supply node that will no longer move ammunition or fuel forward. And while analysts will later argue about efficiency and cost, a combination that modern air war often counts as victory even when it looks ugly on paper, the strike leaves behind contradictions that define contemporary conflict. High technology married to paper maps, satellite-guided weapons flying blind on inertial guesses, advanced air defenses defeated by geometry and timing rather than brute force, and human hesitation playing as large a role as any machine. In the end, the border guard post burns, not because everything worked, but because enough things worked at the right moments while others failed in tolerable ways. And that is the uncomfortable lesson this mission offers. Real warfare is not a demonstration of perfection. It is a negotiation with chaos where marginal success is often the only kind available. The fire at Bela Berezovka does not stay local for long, because within minutes, Russian sensors and patrols begin reacting to secondary effects rather than the strike itself. A rapid reaction platoon stationed less than 5 kilometers away receives fragmented reports over congested radios. Words like airstrike, drones, and missile all overlapping, and by the time armored vehicles begin moving toward the smoke plume, the road network itself becomes a problem. Above them, Russian air patrols scramble with urgency rather than clarity, fighters lifting off with only partial, situational awareness, because the MiG-29 has already vanished below radar coverage, leaving controllers chasing an absence, while air defense crews cycle systems repeatedly, trying to understand how a target slipped through layers that were supposed to make this impossible. The podlet Gwon radar near Klamovo is queried again, logs reviewed, the 6-second lock replayed frame by frame, and operators begin to realize that the contact dismissed earlier aligns too well with the damage now burning on their screen, turning a routine shift decision into an unspoken liability that no one wants to claim responsibility for. On the ground at the destroyed post, survivors attempt to establish a perimeter, but heat and smoke reduce visibility to meters, and the melted remains of BTR-82A vehicles block access routes, forcing soldiers to move on foot through debris fields, where secondary explosions continue to detonate unpredictably as fuel pockets find oxygen. A Panzer S-1 reload crew arrives expecting to rearm an intact system and instead finds launch rails scorched and sensor housings warped by falling missile fragments. The system technically functional, but psychologically compromised. Its operators shaken by the realization that their engagement envelope never included what just happened to them. Command centers further east begin issuing contradictory orders, some demanding immediate reinforcement, others calling for dispersal to avoid follow-on strikes. As dusk approaches, engineers are ordered forward to assess structural damage, but thermal readings remain too high for safe entry, delaying repairs by hours that turn into days, while logistics officers quietly reroute supplies hundreds of kilometers out of the way, burning fuel and time to avoid a node that no longer exists. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian pilot is on final approach back home, managing power carefully on the remaining engine. And only now does the adrenaline drain enough for the weight of the flight to settle in, hands aching, vision still pulsing at the edges, and the understanding that a bird, a wire, or a slightly slower restart would have ended this story differently. Maintenance crews receive the MiG in silence, immediately noting the bird strike damage, missile fragments in the tail, and overstressed airframe components. And while the aircraft is declared repairable, it is grounded for inspection, a reminder that even successful missions often remove assets from the board temporarily. Hours later, satellite imagery begins circulating within Russian command channels, showing the scale of destruction in stark contrast to initial reports. And the realization sets in that a supposedly secure rear area has been proven vulnerable by a single jet carrying only 2 weapons. This triggers a defensive overcorrection, with additional air defense assets repositioned to guard similar sites, thinning coverage elsewhere, and stretching crews already operating at exhaustion levels. An adjustment that looks strong on maps, but creates new seams that attentive planners will inevitably notice. For Ukrainian intelligence, the strike provides more than physical damage, because reaction patterns, radar activations, scramble times, and electronic warfare emissions are all recorded and analyzed, each response revealing habits and thresholds that can be exploited later under different conditions. The action does not end with the explosions. It echoes forward through planning rooms and supply tables, influencing decisions on both sides about where to move, where to hide, and where the next risk will be taken, proving that a single violent moment can reshape a much larger operational rhythm. In this way, the mission's final act is not the falling bombs or the burning compound, but the cascading responses they trigger, a chain of hurried movements, delayed logistics, and altered assumptions that continue long after the smoke thins and the sky above Bella Berioska returns to an uneasy quiet.